Раствори свои глаза. Мгм. Релизы думают, нет, м, да. совушки, конечно.
Его надо уже иметь. Ну ладно, не суть. Ну да. Смертности. Значит, нет. Значит, ну да, все делают дышать. Вот это не видно. Нет, да, нормально, очень, да. Ну, это нормально. Уговорил. Грегор. Питер, Питер. Питер, говорит. Ну да, вот очень. Знаю, что там. Или ношение носков, носов. Да, у меня тоже такая была, кстати, знаю, Углят. Много, ну, это, где плохо? Вот, да. Ну ладно. Ой. Ну, видишь? Ну,
Tütchen heißes Wasser drauf und voilà, fertig sind die Instant-Nudeln. Die kleine Revolution am Snack. Lecker, heißwert und schnell zubereitet. Um mehr über das leckere Fastfood zu erfahren, schauen wir bei Wissen for Free nach Japan. Dort wurden die sogenannten Ramen nämlich erfunden. Ein Japaner verzehrt übrigens im Schnitt mehr als 40 Packungen pro Jahr. Und weltweit werden sogar über 100 Milliarden Packungen jährlich konsumiert. Doch woher kommt eigentlich der Hype um die japanische Nudelsuppe? Entwickelt wurden die Instant-Nudeln als Nachkriegszeit in Japan. Nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg litten viele Einwohner Hunger und die Warteschlangen vor den Essensständen waren oft sehr lange. Momofuku Ando nahm dies zum Anlass, um ein Produkt zu schaffen, das lange haltbar und zu jederzeit verfügbar ist. Und so vermarktete seine Firma Nissin Foods 1958 als Instant-Nudeln unter dem Namen Chicken Ramen. 13 Jahre später brachte Nissin dann die Cup Noodles auf den Markt. Erste Nudelprodukt im Becher. Mittlerweile kennt man das Fertiggericht weltweit unter vielen verschiedenen Markennamen. Die Bechernudeln werden als vorgekochter und getrockneter Nudelblock mit Gewürzpulver und Öl, das sich oft in einer separaten Packung befindet, verkauft. Und so geht's. Die Aromapäckchen zu dem getrockneten Nudelblock geben, mit kochendem Wasser übergießen und ca. 2 Minuten einweichen lassen. Danach kann direkt aus dem Becher gegessen werden. Die Hauptzutaten für die getrockneten Nudeln sind Weizenmehl, Palmöl und Salz. Der getrocknete Nudelblock wurde dabei ursprünglich durch Frittieren gekochter Nudeln hergestellt. Diese Methode wird in asiatischen Ländern immer noch am häufigsten praktiziert. In westlichen Ländern hingegen werden sie meistens luftgetrocknet. Fun Fact: Ramen.
I would say out of all the things I'm expert, I think the number one thing is in fatigue. It's definitely a certification that you can't get from any university. You have to get it from the School of Hard Knocks. But I personally have been so tired for so many years and then overcame that fatigue and then helped tens of thousands of people. So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to show you how to get your energy back. I was doing all the wrong things. I was trying to take all these pills and vitamins, but there was something else underneath my fatigue that I was missing. And until years later, when I finally figured it out, it was like I took a helmet off my head and I finally woke up. So let's talk about the 7 reasons why you're tired. The first reason is adrenal fatigue. You have too much cortisol. What's interesting about cortisol, it's a stress hormone that adapts your body to stress. And under stress, your body switches to running on glucose. Despite what your diet is, if you have too much stress, your body's going to basically run on glucose. This is why there's another name for cortisol. Glucocorticoid. Okay, it's a glucocorticoid. It's a glucose type hormone meant for short-term energy. It's supposed to give you energy, but it ends up making you tired because it's going to mobilize a lot of glucose that's stored in your liver, and it's also going to make glucose out of protein and fat. It's called gluconeogenesis. So here you are having all this glucose flowing through your bloodstream, and then your blood sugar is going to increase, and then insulin's going to come in there and push it down. So when you go through chronic stress, that's when things start to go downhill, and all that glucose will just make you thoroughly exhausted. All right, so the more stress you have, the more your body runs on sugar. Now, there's a little gland in the brain called amygdala, and it's very similar to the adrenal glands on top of the kidney, but it works on your brain. In other words, it addresses a certain type of stress in your brain. And that specific stress is a fear type stress. It's a fear response. So amygdala has everything to do with different shades of fear, whether it's a very high level fear like you're shy to a major panic attack or you're terrified, or right in the middle you have anxiety or you have worry. All those are fear states. And so anytime you have a fear state, the amygdala is involved, and it's going to affect a lot of different biological processes, like your ability to sleep, like your ability to get into a calm state. And anything that's related to fear is going to get you to avoid that fear. You probably heard of the saying, you must face your fears, right? Well, when you face your fears, they no longer are fears, because fear is about avoiding something. And as soon as you don't avoid it and you face it, you don't have it anymore. But the best remedies for an adrenal stress situation or an overactive amygdala would be to take vitamin B1, okay? Good amounts of B1 in the form of nutritional yeast. That is going to make you feel very calm. Now, some other things you can do is take ashwagandha. I have some more information on that in the link down below. But ashwagandha is an adaptogen. It increases your tolerance to stress. There's many other herbs that are adaptogens, but ashwagandha is one of the top herbs. And then we have sleep. More sleep, better control over your stress, better adrenal function. And I will get to sleep in a second. But the last thing I want to mention is physical work. That more ashwagandha. That is going to make you feel very calm, and you face it to get you to avoid that fear. You probably heard of the saying, you must face your fears, right? Well, when you face your fears, they no longer are fears, because fear is about avoiding something. And as soon as you don't avoid it and you face it, you don't have it anymore. But the best remedies for an adrenal stress situation or an overactive amygdala would be to take vitamin B1, okay? Good amounts of B1 in the form of nutritional yeast. That is going to make you feel very calm. Now, some other things you can do is take ashwagandha, and B1, okay? Good amounts of B1 in the form of nutritional yeast. That is going to make you feel very calm. Now, some other things you can do is take ashwagandha. I have some more information on that in the link down below. But ashwagandha is an adaptogen. It increases your
Ах, ладно.
tolerance to stress. There's many other herbs you can do is take ashwagandha. I have some more information on that in the link down below. But ashwagandha is an adaptogen. It increases your tolerance to stress. There's many herbs that are adaptogens, but ashwagandha is one of the top herbs. And then we have sleep. More sleep, better control over your stress, better adrenal function. And I will get to sleep in a second. But the last thing I want to mention is physical work. That's a very great therapy for stress. Like any physical work that you can start doing, it will really help you release that stress. Now, exercise is okay, but physical work is a lot better, because physical work and also exercise helps to deplete that stress energy that tends to build up that prevents you from sleeping. Number two, sleep. Okay, poor sleep will make you tired, and many times you can't sleep because you have high cortisol because you're stressed, especially if it's between 12 midnight and 2 o'clock in the middle of the night. That is when you're supposed to have the lowest amount of cortisol. But if your adrenals are overactive, that's the time that you're most awake. And I had a problem with that for years until I figured things out. Now, one thing about sleep, there's a sleep hormone called melatonin. I recently did a very interesting video on melatonin because there's two types of melatonin. There is one type that's in your bloodstream and in the pineal gland, but there's another type of melatonin that is in all of your cells. It's deep in the cells. It's called a subcellular melatonin. And the way that you increase that melatonin is through infrared. Did you realize that over 50% of the sun rays are infrared? So that infrared is actually increasing melatonin in all of your body's cells, which will greatly help your sleep. But another purpose of melatonin is to act as a powerful antioxidant, even more powerful than glutathione in your liver. And so melatonin is really important in countering all the stress that we experience and preventing a lot of oxidative damage and free radical damage. And so if you can get out in the sun, definitely do that for a good period of time. But if it's winter and you can't do that, you can also get infrared from a fireplace or a campfire or some candles or red light therapy. But the sensation of infrared is like the heat that you feel from the sun or from a fire or from a light, like incandescent light. I'm not talking about the artificial lights that they have now, like from your computer and your cell phone, which will all counter the infrared wavelength and deplete your melatonin. So that's probably one of the reasons why people have a hard time sleeping is they're sitting in front of a computer all day long and they can't seem to recharge the melatonin. Now, the other thing I'm going to recommend for sleep, which is a really great protocol, which I use on my body, is I take 4 of my sleep aid, okay, right before bed, about 20 minutes, and 3 of my D3 and K2. That seems to work very effectively to get into a really nice, deep delta wave sleep, and it's allowed me to get like even up to 9 hours of sleep. So I will use that when I need to sleep a little bit longer, but presently my sleep cycles are in pretty good shape. Vitamin D3 helps and deplete your melatonin. So, but if it's winter and you can't do that, you can also get infrared from a fireplace or a campfire or some candles or red light therapy. But the sensation of infrared is like the heat that you feel from the sun or from the fire or from a light, like incandescent light. I'm not talking about the artificial lights that they have now, like from your computer and your cell phone, which will all counter the infrared wavelength and deplete your melatonin. So that's probably one of the reasons why people have a hard time sleeping is they're sitting in front of a computer all day long and they can't seem to recharge the melatonin. Now, the other thing I'm going to recommend for sleep, which is a really great protocol, which I use on my body, is I take 4 of sleep aid, okay, right before bed, about 20 minutes, and 3 of my D3 and K2. Okay, I use on my body, take 4 of my sleep aid, okay, right before bed, about 20 minutes, and 3 of my D3 and K2. That seems to work very effectively to get into a really nice, deep delta wave sleep, and it's allowed me to get like even up to 9 hours of sleep. So I will use that when I need to sleep a little bit longer, but presently my sleep cycles are in pretty good shape. Vitamin D3 helps to reset the sleep centers. It's great for jet lag, and it's very, very important in sleep cycles. And so taking vitamin D right before you go to bed is actually going to help you sleep. It's not going to wake you up. All right, number 3, post-viral syndrome, okay? So let's just say you just had COVID or some type of viral flu, and now you have this residual fatigue. You have chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, the medical term for this is called myalgic encephalomyelitis. Now, what does that mean? That's a fancy term for you have a combination of muscle pain and inflammation and soreness with inflammation of your brain causing cognitive deficits as well as fatigue. Now, that medical condition mimics the symptoms of a B1 deficiency as well as a B3 deficiency. So really what I think is going on is you have this inflammatory immune response, and it's creating massive oxidation, massive free radical damage. And you're going into this infection with an already empty bucket of B vitamins. And the residual fatigue that you have from this infection is really a vitamin deficiency. That's what it is. Primarily vitamin B1, but also the other B vitamins, as well as other nutrients as well. And so if you just had an infection and you start taking nutritional yeast and or B1, try to find a natural source, and you also took vitamin D3 with zinc, okay, you're going to start to have more energy. There's some other things that you can take too as powerful antioxidants like NAC, and not taking a melatonin, but being exposed to the infrared, which naturally increases melatonin, which I already mentioned is a very powerful antioxidant, probably even more powerful than gluten. Now, the other point I want to bring up about viruses is that when you have these viruses that are dormant in your body, or viruses, okay? So you had an infection, let's say in high school, and then 20 years later, it comes out of remission. It usually comes out of remission when you experience stress, because cortisol is an immune suppressive hormone. So it actually lowers your immune system. This is why a lot of people are on prednisone for all sorts of infections, because it gets rid of the symptoms. But what really doing is wiping out the inflammation, but it's also wiping out the entire immune response. So when you have high levels of cortisol, your immune system temporarily goes to sleep, and the door opens to viruses to keep you down. So if you have any type of post-viral symptoms, whether it's fatigue or whatever, do whatever you can to find the cause of your stress and try to get rid of it, because it's going to be really hard to get rid of that fatigue if you still have the stress situation that's unresolved. And unfortunately, losses can be a part of that as well. Bereavement. When you go through losses, the cortisol increases, the stress increases, and the viruses can come out and create all sorts of problems as well. So in that case, if you have that situation, definitely follow the things that I'm talking about: getting more sleep, getting more nutrition, getting IR, taking certain nutrients, etc. All right. Another cause of fatigue is having Lyme disease, and that comes from a spirochete, which is a type of bacteria that can go in your body and create an immune reaction. All the symptoms from Lyme are actually coming from your own immune system trying to kill off this microbe, but it can't find it. So I recommend doing a natural type antibiotic, and that would be something like oregano, garlic, thyme, sage, things that are natural that can help boost your immune system, but without the side effects. Number 5, insulin resistance, okay? If you're on a high-carb diet, realize that your garlic immune system trying to kill off this microbe the problems as well. So in that case, if you have that situation, definitely follow the things that I'm talking about: getting more sleep, getting more nutrition, getting IR, taking certain nutrients, etc. All right, another cause of fatigue is having Lyme disease, and that comes from a spirochete, which is a type of bacteria that go in your body and create an immune reaction. All the symptoms from Lyme, from your own system trying to kill this microbe, but it can't find it. So I recommend doing a natural type antibiotic, and that would be something like oregano, garlic, thyme, things that are natural, boost your immune system, but without the side effects. 5, insulin resistant. If you're on a high carb diet, realize that your brain is going to be slightly more unconscious because that's what carbs do. They make your brain go to sleep. So you're going to definitely need a nap after you eat. When you go on a low carb diet, it actually wakes up your brain. You actually become more conscious. You are running your brain on ketones, which is a preferred fuel. And so if you haven't already gone on a ketogenic diet with intermittent fasting, that can create the biggest effect on your energy more than anything. And I did put a link down below for those of you that are new to that topic. All right, number 6, low stomach acids. If you don't have stomach acid, especially if you, as you get older and you lose the acidity in your stomach, absorb B12, you're not going to be able to absorb iron too well. Both of those conditions can cause anemia. You're not going to be able to break down protein too well. That can cause fatigue. You're going to be more susceptible to getting SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That can make you tired. Not to mention all the digestive problems that you're going to have. Those can make you tired as well. And the simple remedy is a combination of apple cider vinegar and betaine hydrochloride. But just realize that you need to take a lot of it in the beginning. You may need to take 5 to 6 to 7 tablets right before you eat for some weeks before you really start to turn things around, because betaine hydrochloride is not a very concentrated amount of hydrochloric acid. It's a very weak type of acid that takes a while to build up. All right, and the last point I'm going to bring up is vitamin deficiencies. That can create fatigue. It's not as common, but it can create fatigue. And I just mentioned the B12, I just mentioned the iron, but I didn't mention potassium. In all of your cells, you got a sodium potassium that generates electrical energy for your cells. So you need a lot of potassium to generate that energy. It's very easy to get sodium, it's more difficult to get potassium. And the way you get that is through large amounts of salads. That's right. That can give you a lot of energy. So that's something, if you're looking for, you might want to start increasing more salad to increase more potassium, as well as the next mineral, which is involved in energy and ATP, which is magnesium. So you can get a lot of magnesium and potassium from having large salads. I know that I don't have a big salad. I'm a little more. Now, out of all the things you can do, the most important thing is to straighten out. I didn't know that in the past. And so I was trying to take all these vitamins and do all these different things on top of eating too many carbs. It never worked. So you need to get on keto and do intermittent fasting. Number 2, you want to work on your stress so you can sleep. That's number 2, because they are connected. And then number 3, many times there could be some underlying residue, some post-infection, latent virus that's coming out of remission, in which you take more B1, D3, zinc, and some of the other things that I recommend. All right, if you have not seen my video on melatonin, very important video, check it out here.
Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano Tea. I am Alicia, your host, and today we're going to talk all about dynamics. It's been brought to my attention that I haven't had a dedicated video about dynamics, so I figured that today's the day. We're going to live it up, we're going to talk dynamics, and it'll be fun, I hope. What we're going to do in today's video is talk about what dynamics are, the basics, so even just starting out, you'll be able to follow this video. I want to talk about dynamics across different musical eras, because the way you play dynamics changes depending if you're playing a Baroque piece or a modern piece. So we're going to touch on that. And then I'm going to give you tips for being able to play dynamics effectively. Now, as far as I know, there's no implement this special tip and then 5 minutes later you have great dynamics forever. I haven't come across anything like, if you have an insider tip that gonna be amazing like that, just please let me and everyone else know. That would be great. This video isn't going to be instantly become amazing at dynamics. But I'm hoping that it'll give you some ideas of things that you can do in your practice to slowly over the course of time improve your ability with dynamics. Anyway, let's get started. I really wanted to share this question that Virgil asked about dynamics, since it's the basis of the entire video, and it's something many of you guys do, including myself. So here it is. I'm an adult beginner who just started this year. Wow, that's pretty recent. And so in 2018 still, but I digress. And currently my piano teacher is gearing me to grade 3. Subject, I'm currently having a little hiccup with dynamics as I tend to either play too hard, too soft. Frequently receive comments from the teacher about abrupt crescendos. I'm still developing my dynamic ear since I'm new to the piano, so I come to your YouTube channel to find some points and some enlightenment, but alas, none could be found, or maybe I missed it. No, I don't actually think, except for like little bits and pieces in video, dedicated video. So anyway, that's what this is, a video focused around dynamics and how to practice dynamics. Before we get into the how of playing dynamics, let's talk about the what. What are dynamics? Well, dynamics are just symbols that represent volume. We have symbols like P, which stands for piano, that tells us to play quietly. We have these V shapes telling us to get louder and to get quieter, crescendos and decrescendos, etc. What you see here on the screen are the basic dynamic markings you're going to be running into. Basically everything all the way from really, really soft to really, really loud. Although pianissimo and fortissimo are pretty uncommon. You won't come across them very much. If you're playing piano music that has like P over here and that has an F, like so quiet and loud, that's going to be indicating that you want to do an abrupt change. You're basically going from quiet to loud with little to no transition. Now, if you're playing a piece of music that has, say, a P followed by a crescendo, and then maybe finished with the forte or mezzo forte or something like that, it's telling you that you're going to go from quiet to loud gradually, note by note. Sometimes crescendos and diminuendos last for just a measure. Sometimes they last measures, but the idea is the same. You want to like gradually change your volume. So that's the what of dynamics. And before we to techniques and stuff like that, I want to talk about the different eras you'll apply dynamics in say Bach and Baroque music versus Chopin and Romantic music. And so in the Baroque period between about 1600 and 1750, pianos as we know them today didn't exist. When people wrote and played keyboard music, it was usually on a harpsichord or board, and organs were another popular keyboard as well. The harpsichord and clavichord just didn't have much capacity for dynamic expression, which is why dynamics written for Baroque music is so different. In Baroque music, you'll see terraced dynamics, which just means abrupt dynamic changes. You'll go from piano to mezzo piano with little transition, or you'll have even more dramatic changes like piano to forte. These sudden changes in volume were what keyboard instruments were capable of doing back in the day. They weren't really able to do anything more subtle. And this is important to keep in mind when you're playing music from this time period. In the classical period, between about 1750 and 25, pianos were being built, developed, and fine-tuned. So composers at the beginning of the classical era, such as Haydn, would write a lot of keyboard sonatas for harpsichord. The era, classical composers such as Beethoven would write sonatas on a more modern sounding piano. The damper pedals on these early pianos were very different, but dynamically they differ to pianos of today. So that's why you'll see much more extreme dynamic ranges in classical piano sonatas. So Beethoven especially, for example, was fond of fortissimo or fortissimo. In the Romantic period, from about 1825 to 1900, pianos became the thing that we know and love today. They went to development, things like the damper pedal improved, the volume and expressive quality have improved, and this is the era where you really saw piano superstars begin to pop up, such as Liszt and Alkin. In this era, composers really started adding dynamic detail to their music. You'll see plenty of accents, forzandos, and other touch markings with a wide range of dynamic contrasts, and plenty of crescendos and diminuendos. There also tends to be more detail with pedal markings, since this is when the piano had developed a modern style damper pedal. In the modern era, basically from 1900 to now-ish, dynamic markings are as variable as the era itself. You have early 20th century composers like Bartók who wrote these specific dynamics and articulations, basically leaving no note behind. And other similar composers would be guys like Kavalevsky, Shostakovich, etc. You have composers such as Debussy who insist on subtlety in their music, which is very, very different from the drama of the Romantic era. And then the kind of obscure sounding modernism era, and then like, yeah, jazz, pop, blues, all of those styles beyond that. It's some grip on which dynamic styles were common in which eras, just so you interpret them effectively. Nothing's worse than a romantic sounding interpretation of Claire de Lune. Claire de Lune was an era piece, and you really like have to like light touches is so crucial in that piece. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard pianists do this. With like big Liszt style grand gestures, just like totally not appropriate for that style of music. When it comes down to it, playing dynamics on the piano is really just a matter of how quickly and you press down a key. Quicker and firmer means a louder note, whereas slower and softer equals a quieter note. One thing that I've noticed over the years of teaching is that people tend to lean in one direction volumely. That's not a word. People tend to lean in one direction on the volume spectrum. So some people have a tendency to be quiet players just naturally, and some people have a tendency to be like heavy-handed, and that's the calling too. And it's good to have an idea of where on the spectrum you fall, because then you can work on it. So since I tend to be like a very like heavy-handed player, I'm really into the fortes, but I'm not good at the pianos, then that gives me a sense that that's like where I spend more time. I need to focus on finding nuance in quieter volumes. So here's one of the biggest tips I can give about playing dynamics on the piano. This is like a physical tip, just as accurate as it is tangible. You really just have to feel it to understand. Project dynamics with your arms and not just your fingers. If you use only your fingers to create the force or soft, the tone will always be a little thick. So for example, your fortes with just your string will sound a little harsh, and your pianos will sound a little weightless and empty. Now, I encourage you to experiment with this on your own, because you should be able to, once you start playing around with it, see if you can notice it. But if you start playing with more weight from your arms as opposed to just your finger, you get a more robust dynamic tone. So your forte will sound warm and open, and your pianos won't just disappear into thin air. It's really, you just need to sit down and play around with it so you can start feeling it out. Playing dynamics comes from experience and feedback. So if you're relatively new to the piano, still much, because it does take quite a while to really train your ear and to train your body. The first few years when I teach people piano, we tend to just creating contrast. So we won't really focus on like nuance so much as being able to play a forte, being able to play a piano, and maybe we'll do like some of the ones in between. But it's about, just like learning the bright, big, abrupt contrasts to start. That I would recommend doing, even if you're just starting out, is record yourself playing regularly. And this is a useful thing to do. So specifically for dynamics, it'll help train your ear. And it's interesting how when we play, we can't hear, well, I can't hear like the harshness in my playing so much when I'm actually playing it. But when I sit back and listening, I can tell, like, okay, that forte was really harsh. Or maybe, again, if you're the opposite, you tend to be a quiet player, you're like, ooh, that like barely came through. That was like a insubstantial wisp of air. So spend time developing a great forte first, and piano first, before starting to worry too much about the nuance. This can take quite a long time. And you can practice these dynamics in your pieces, but you can also practice them with pieces too. And that can actually be a way to liven up the scale. If you're used to playing your scales, just like whatever default volume that you play at, it could be a good experience to experiment playing them quietly, or to play them loudly, or whatever. That might bring some life into your technical exercises too. So you know how when you go to live theater and you're sitting in the audience, the actors on the stage like look pretty normal, but then when you see them up close, wow, they have a lot of makeup on. It's this idea of over dramatizing that carries over to the piano and other creative forms of expression as well. What I find really interesting is if you're just like sitting at the piano by yourself playing, you might play and be like, oh yeah, that was a crescendo. But if you're listening to it as an audience member or just listening to a recording, you might realize like, oh, that barely came through at all. Oftentimes in our head, what we think is doesn't necessarily project outside of like our own head. And we often have to be more over dramatic than we think is necessary for it to sound the appropriate level of drama. Does that make sense? And again, this is something that you can improve and work on by recording yourself play. Just such a useful thing to do. It's kind of a pain, I get it, but it's so useful. I encourage you to exaggerate your dynamics, which has two benefits. The first one being that your dynamics become more noticeable, which is what we've already been talking about, and doing so gets comfortable playing with a wider dynamic. Being comfortable with a wider dynamic range will help you eventually learn how to do subtlety. I truly believe you can't learn how to be subtle with something until you learn how to be really dramatic with it. So you have to start out here in order to figure out how to, like, I don't know, get it in here. I don't know if this is making any sense with my wine gestures. And that's why I don't recommend learning guys like Debussy until, like, because Debussy is all about subtlety. So learning his music before you're a mature enough piano player to do so usually ends up in a less ideal scenario, like I talked about in the past, like interpreting Debussy's music in a romantic way, or just not being able to like properly convey that. Another thing that'll help your dynamic playing is to really map out your dynamics across an entire piece. So for example, say that you're learning Liszt's Liebesdrama number 3. There are 6 pages in this piece, and the crux or climax of the piece is on page 4, which is what you can see on the screen right now. Now, it's worth getting a sense of where the climactic moments of your piece is and then work around that. So if page 4 requires my weightiest, most dramatic fortissimo, then I need to make sure that I don't waste my loudest playing, my best fortissimo playing before this point. It means any fortissimo I come across before page 4 can't be as loud. This is really important. Otherwise, this moment won't have as much drama and oomph as it needs to tell the story effectively. Even when you're learning a piece like Clair de Lune, which barely goes above a mezzo piano in its entire duration, you still have to kind of go through the same like dynamic plan. If mezzo piano is like the highest volume, where does that occur? Does that occur with where the climactic moment of the piece is? Which usually, yes, usually the loudest part of the piece is going to be the climactic moment. So you still want to go through it and map it out and figure out where the peaks are. And then one thing too is if your dynamic range in a piece is limited. So say the quietest range is pianissimo and your loudest range is mezzo piano, that's not a very wide range. So you have to think about how you're going to be able to differentiate a piano from a pianissimo from a mezzo piano, and that could be a little bit more of a challenge to do. So one thing you could consider is maybe you make the mezzo piano a little louder than you would otherwise in a different piece. Not so much that you would end up making the whole thing sound romantic, but maybe just a little bit. If you have a dynamic plan for your piece, that should be able to then make your dynamics in general more effective. One point that I always try to get across to my students, and one that they're really likely to ignore, is the idea that you want to integrate dynamics right from the start of learning a piece. I know that sounds crazy, because when you're first learning a piece, there's all the notes you have to figure out, there's all the rhythms you have to figure out, there's just like an overwhelming amount of detail all at once. But
wait a second.
if you went in the beginning, which seems difficult, but well, you're building that dynamic into the way you practice so that it just ends up feeling more natural and more organic than it would if you added it over top of it. It's kind of like how a stew tastes better the second day because all the spices have had a day to like sit and meld together, going down the cooking comparison rabbit hole again. I see, but the dynamics end up integrating that way and sounding more natural. And you also shouldn't have to spend a lot of time like memorizing dynamics later on because if you've just always been playing a certain passage at a certain volume, it'll just be instinctual. This also helps you avoid mechanical playing. So if you're focused on creating a beautiful sound and playing dynamics as a part of that right from the get-go, then that's going to safeguard you from having robotic performances when you're not focused on expression or dynamics of any kind and you're literally just learning notes and the rhythms. There's a tendency to just like compartmentalize and play in a way that sounds mechanical. So again, that's just another idea. All right, so here's a quick summary of the most important steps of playing dynamics on the piano. Understand the era you're playing so that your dynamic choices are appropriate. Use art.
Алло! Привет, мам, привет! Да, я сплю, я сегодня еще делаю. Ну да, сплю.
Нет, ты вообще заболеешь, что ли? Заболел, поэтому так долго спишь?
Ну, да не знаю, нет, просто так. Отдых не знаю.
А долго не очень спишь днем, да?
Ну да, да. Ладно.
Если хочешь, завтра приезжай после обеда. Вот где-то с 3 часов дома будем. Я все хочу, чтобы ты к нам приехал.
Ладно, там как-то, не знаю, такая здоровая. Ты-то здорова, нормально, у тебя нормально?
Да нормально все, нормально, просто тебя долго не вижу. Не знаю, как ты живешь, переживаю.
Да тихо,
Как
нормально?
тебе?
Нормально, тихо, нормально.
И у тебя еда-то есть?
Да, пытаюсь.
Ладно, на следующей неделе, если что, только выходной мы сможем выехать. На этой неделе нам некогда будет.
Ладно, смотри, да, ладно.
Ну ты звони, если что-то, ладно?
Ладно.
Звони, пожалуйста.
Ладно, да.
Если надумаешь, завтра приезжай, после 3 мы дома.
Спасибо вам, спасибо. деньги туда, ложи прямо туда. Ну, Oh, thank you, Miss Jules. Thank you, Dubs. Hey, gratitude. Toxic journal. Toxic. Toxic. А, нет, по-другому там было сделано. Да. Если это уровень труд, ну, он посмотрит, он про себя, да, ладно. Конечно. Жарец. Нет, нет.
Как делают свитер? Это Банкиру, самый балансовый супермаркет. Банкиру подберет выгодный кредит.
Almost all of there, in one way or another, will spike insulin. Even protein spikes. But when protein spikes insulin, it's also bringing up something called glucagon, which kind of balances it out and kind of makes it a net zero response. But let's talk about the foods that really don't have an insulin spike. And if they do, they are super negligible. Now, there is a difference between foods that cause traditional spike in glucose versus foods that don't trigger much of an insulin spike. And what you have to look at mainly is fiber. Okay, the biggest piece is fiber. Fiber and fat do not spike insulin. But the problem that we face with fiber is generally with fiber, it's usually combined with other things, combined with starches, stuff like that. So you're still getting an insulin spike. So I've got a few foods for you. Some of them are fiber, some of them are fats, and then I even have a protein. Now, first off, I want you to take a look at the images on the screen. Okay, this is from a study that was really testing insulin concentration, glucose, everything. And I want you to look down at the bottom right there and see where it shows proteins. See how a lot of the proteins have a higher spike in insulin, even compared to other foods, even to some starches. Isn't that wild? Well, what's happening is you're having that insulin spike. The document isn't showing, is it's not showing the glucagon spike. So the actual relative amount of insulin that's related in terms of blood glucose isn't really there. Okay, so you can have a lower spike in insulin, but actually have a worse impact. Anyhow, let's get to fun stuff. So the first one is going to be Shirataki Noodles. Okay, these are a specific kind of glucomannan fiber. They are pretty much solid, soluble fiber, which almost sounds kind of funny, but a soluble fiber is water in. I am a fan of soluble fiber because it acts in the gut and it has a powerful, it actually has a more benefit. Okay, so in addition to just being a fiber that pushes things through, it actually does something. It feeds the bacteria within our gut. Okay, so that is what's called a glucomannan fiber. Okay, another one that is really good is one called galactomannan fiber, which is going to be in things like fenugreek. Okay, now that's not necessarily a food, so I don't want to get you excited about that one, but it's in the same ballpark. Okay, hearts. Okay, so palm hearts, parts of palm pasta, like that. I've talked about my channel. practically no insulin spike whatsoever because they are soluble fibers that draw water in, don't have much of an impact, and there's not other carbs surrounding them. Think about beans for a minute. Beans have a high amount of fiber in them. Also have a bunch of some indigestible sugars and some very digestible sugars. That's why they are a high carb food. One's resistant, and I'm not going to talk about resistant stuff today. Another one is going to be chia and flax. You can go munch on these things willy-nilly on their own, but there are things called flax crackers. Like if you look out there, there's plenty of companies that make crackers out of straight flax, just flaxseed, right? And flax contains what's called mucilage. Okay, mucilage is a kind of fiber. Like if you were to take chia and you were to add water to it and let it sit, what gives it that gelatinous feel, like why it gels up and makes like a pudding with chia, is that it is a very, very, very powerful hydrocolloid, meaning it's a lot of water in. Not only is this good for satiety, but it gives you a very clear mechanical demonstration of how soluble fiber works. Okay, so foods that are high in mucilage. So we've got chia, we've got flax, with those flax crackers, kelp, certain kinds of seaweed, even red seaweed. What's kind of weird is that even carrageenan, don't go looking for foods with carrageenan, but carrageenan that's coming from red seaweed is a form of soluble fiber in a way. It's just kind of weird. Some of the snacks that I talked about, there's a link down below about Thrive Market, an online membership-based grocery store. Like you can just sort by snacks. You can look at the fiber content. You can do all kinds of things. So no matter what kind of diet you're doing, whether it's keto or fasting or whatever, it is perfect for those kinds of things. Because I know they have some seaweed snacks. I know they have fish. Anyway, so use that link down below. 25% off your first order and a gift when you use that link because they're a huge sponsor on this channel and they sponsored this video. So check them out down below. So I mentioned kelp and seaweed. I'll get into that as sort of the next one. This is a food that you can eat that is not going to trigger an insulin spike. Okay, practically no starch to it whatsoever. It's pretty much just going to be some nutrients, some minerals, and some fiber. And once again, it is a soluble fiber. Now, there are multiple different categories of seaweed. One of my favorite ones is nori, okay, just straight up nori. So if you're looking for something that might be a simple snack, you could literally take nori, roll up shirataki noodles in it, put a little bit of like tamari or a little bit of sauce that has no carbs whatsoever, and you're not going to have an insulin spike. So that's kind of taste like a little Asian burrito. You know, something I've done before. Okay, the next one. Now we have fibers play a role for a second, but let's touch on fats. Straight fats are not going to spike insulin. You notice on pull that document back up on the screen again. Fats aren't even investigated. They're looking at some nut butters, things like that, but fats are looked at because fats don't trigger insulin response. They can to a very, very small degree, but it's almost immeasurable. So in this case, I would recommend that you look at coconut butter. Okay? Coconut butter has a higher fiber content, although most of the fiber in coconut butter is insoluble fiber versus soluble fiber. It doesn't make it bad. It just still has no blood sugar impact. Looking at a relatively high fat content, only a couple of grams of carbs, most of which are coming from insoluble fiber. So that, in essence, if you are watching insulin, is it a good food to eat? Granted, there is a big difference between doing keto and doing a low insulin diet, okay? But either way, they can both interchange and have a lot of crossover. The next ones are going to be vegetables that are very, very, very high in soluble fiber, have practically no insulin impact. And yes, they're still technically carbs. It's going to be bok choy and Swiss chard, okay? Not only only are they super packed with nutrients, not only are they great for cooking, not only are they tremendous if you saute them in some coconut oil and still don't change the insulin impact, but they are packed with the insoluble fiber, not attached to another starch, not attached like squash to other starches and things like that. We're just getting straight up soluble fiber in a good green leafy vegetable form. Okay, now it's funny again. If we look at that same document, we see the proteins. Now, if we look at beef as compared to some of these other foods, see, beef has a relatively moderate insulin spike, not compared to like all foods. But it's interesting though when you look at eggs. Eggs have a very low insulin spike compared to other proteins. So I wanted to throw a protein in there in case we were looking for a higher protein, low insulin spiking food. Eggs would be the best. It's just interesting because they still spike insulin, but the glucagon response is nice and high with eggs as well. But in the world of all of the different kinds of proteins, it is triggering the lowest insulin spike. Probably has to do with the fact that it's pretty concentrated with fat, and that's slowing down and attenuating any kind of response with that. Interestingly enough, if you look at proteins, they're going to have a high relative insulin score. What is per gram of carbohydrate that is in it, it's going to have a very high insulin score. But guess what? There's like 0 in protein. That's why that number is so high. Make sense? So it's like if you have 0.00001 gram of carbohydrates in some meat or some protein, of course the insulin response that you get relative to the amount of carbs is going to be astronomical. But we have to take into consideration that that's relative to how many carbs are in it. Okay, so beef, eggs, those comes down to low insulin spike, but eggs are going to be the best. So to recap, shirataki noodles, hearts of palm noodles, hearts of palm pasta. Okay, we have things like kelp, chia, flaxseed crackers. Okay, seaweed snacks, definitely. Butter is going to be a tremendous one. Bok choy, Swiss chard, and eggs. So as always, keep it locked here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.
Во все, что тебя окружает, уже кто-то инвестирует. Инвестирует в кеды, в чизбургеры.
Ну, куда понял себя, слушай. Я видел. Нет, понимаешь, какая ситуация? Что значит прощать? Но он это мне... Если вы моей смерти хотите, то есть что значит прощать? То есть, когда таракана убили, даже прощать некому и некого, понимаешь? То есть ты понимаешь, то есть о чем вообще разговор непонятно. То есть, да, понимаешь.
Здравствуйте, в эфире новости Удмуртии. В студии Симонова, и смотрите в этом выпуске. Водители попросили не мешать уборочной технике, предупредили о штрафах. Новое наказание сделать дворы и улицы чище. Торжественно и возвращенно в Сарапуле в одной из старейших гимназий республики дали старт году образования в Удмуртии. Науку поддержали грантами. Ученые Удмуртии получили на обновление оборудования. И 3 века на страже закона, который Удмуртия отмечает двойной юбилей. Погода в Удмуртии бьет рекорды. С начала января в республике уже выпала месячная норма снега. По данным ветра это 42 миллиметра. При этом температура воздуха в Удмуртии сохраняется в пределах нормы от 8 до 14 градусов днем, а самой холодной обещает стать ночь с воскресенья на понедельник. Термометр покажет 20 градусов мороза.
Основная неприятность в виде метели и переметания прошла. Время сохраняется, продолжительный снег, но основная неприятность в виде метели и переметания
до 14 градусов днем, а самой холодной обещает стать ночь с воскресенья на понедельник. Термометр покажет 20 градусов мороза.
основная неприятность в виде метели и переметания дорог прошла. В ближайшее время продолжительный снег, но интенсивность его снижается. Ночью я даже сказал, что он будет небольшим. Завтра он через нас будет ходить молодой частный циклон. Будет продолжительно умеренный, местами сильный, но ветер не будет таким сильным.
Синоптики и спасатели просят автомобилистов быть внимательнее и воздержаться от дальней дороги. Снегопады продлятся как минимум до понедельника. На борьбу со снежным коллапсом в Ижевские городские власти минувшей ночью направили 158 единиц. Днем количество спецмашин уменьшили на треть. Они вывозили снег, расчищали дороги, тротуары и межквартальные проезды, в том числе и в отдаленных районах, например, в Орловском и Кузьминском. Дорожная техника в Ижевске будет работать в режиме до окончания снегопада. К устранению последствий метели подключились и управляющие компании. Но, как ни странно, мешают навести порядок на парковках, которые не убирают машины во время механизированной уборки. С этого года таких водителей могут наказать рублем. В нюансах новых правил разбиралась Анна Карлсон.
Юрий Уржинцев работает трактористом одной из ижевских управляющих уже 7-й год. И каждую зиму чистить от снега ему мешают вот такие подснежники. Спецтехнике сложно даже проехать мимо таких авто.
Трудновато, потому что для разворота трактора нужно как минимум 6 метров. Не подъехать, не убрать снег. Претензий жильцов.
Жители дома о механизированной уборке предупреждают как минимум за сутки, рассказывают в управляющей компании. Но при этом в день уборки машин во дворах всегда есть. Такие автосугробы уже вечные. Автомобилисты ездят редко, не отгоняют свои авто во время уборки во дворах. По данным Совета дома на Петрова 51А, только у них таких автолюбителей как минимум 4. И если раньше оставалось взывать только к совести, то с этого года вступил в силу новый закон, позволяющий карать рублем тех, кто мешает уборке снега на придомовой. В региональный закон об административной ответственности номер 57 изменения внес Госсовет Республики. По новым правилам, если в осенне-зимний период не двигается с места дольше, чем 7 дней, и при этом мешает механизированной уборке, его владельца ожидает штраф. От 1,5 до 4 тысяч рублей для физических лиц, для юридических до 60. При этом эвакуировать машину городские власти не будут. Жалобно в административную города под заявлением...
Ну, это, конечно, глупо, но как бы, ну, поставили говорит, да нет, ну, молчи уже.
Вот как сами жители, так и их управляющая компания. В обращении нужно указать адрес, марку и госномер автомобиля, а также приложить фотографию с указанием.
При поступлении такой информации сотрудники будут выезжать. Получается, если по закону там более 7 суток, то есть ну, с момента поступления информации там 8 сутки, и будет видно о том, что трогалась машина с места, да, или она там уже в сугробе, вся в снегу. То есть по каким-то косвенным признакам будет видно, что машина длительное время находится вот на этом месте и мешает уборке.
Никаких поблажек не будет и для тех, кто работает, например, вахтовым методом. Им в городской администрации следует заранее позаботиться о месте долгосрочной парковки. При этом в законе четко написано, как будут отчитываться эти 7 дней, после которых наступает административная ответственность. На помощь городским властям готовы прийти управляющие компании. Для них машины, мешающие уборке снега и льда, давно уже стали головной болью.
Нужно отслеживать, здесь наверняка будут задействованы и работники управляющих компаний, которые будут, возможно, актировать наличие неубранной машины в течение 7 дней. Возможно, сейчас весь жилой фонд активно оборудуется камерами наружного видения, возможно, видеофиксация будет также использоваться на базах по этим вопросам. И хотя изменения в закон уже вступили в силу, в административной инспекции Ижевска пока не зарегистрировано ни одного заявления. Анна Калоризна, Юрий Дроздов. Новости. В Удмуртии 2022 объявлен годом образования. Планы у республики большие. Это строительство школ, ремонт, оснащение их современным оборудованием, создание IT-центров, новые места в детских садах, решение кадрового вопроса и многое другое. Торжественно открыл год образования во время рождественства в Сарапуле. Подробности у Анастасии Птико.
Еще ни разу не играли. Сегодня решила выйти. Ну, как дома.
Вторая жизнь маминого свадебного платья начинается красиво, на настоящем балу. Несколько лет назад в Сарапульской гимназии возродили традицию, прерванную в 1918-м. И теперь раз в год актовый зал старейшей городской школы вновь встречает дам в роскошных нарядах и галантных кавалеров.
Потому что это очень красиво, потому что так было всегда в этой школе, потому что это детям нравится, потому что это ожидаемо. Дети всегда очень долго готовятся.
Готовились к торжественному вечеру 2 месяца, оттачивали танцевальные па после уроков в репертуаре, как и больше 100 лет назад, торжественный полонез, вальс и котельон. Для многих этот школьный бал последний. Восьмиклассница Настя Соловейкина собирается поступать в медицинский. Поэтому следующие годы до самого выпускного девушка собирается посвятить только учебе.
Классно готовить. Математики у нас уже начинается дополнительные, уже начинают готовиться к экзаменам.
А республике нужны специалисты, и регион нуждается в педагогах, в современных аграриях,
Я ничего этого не понимаю.
Об этом говорили уже в Сарапуле на активе города.
Ну, Ирина, надо тут понимать, не женщина, что тут понимать. Да. Симон. Я там Hello. Йоркшир. Боянидзе. Опс. Это чё, выбросили? Это что? Да наоборот, значит. Вот наоборот, значит, правильно. Так, что тут вообще?
С открытием новых производств в ближайшие 3 года будет 1500 рабочих мест. Закрыть кадровый вопрос Саратов даже вместе с ближайшими районами не сможет. Поэтому готовить кадры нужно под потребности экономики, считает Александр Причалов. Такую задачу в год образования, объявленный в Удмуртии в 2022, поставил перед руководителями среднего специального образования.
Переформатирование работы на экономику – это будет главным пунктом, потому что если образование будет работать на конкретный сектор экономики, на конкретные предприятия, здесь будут и студенты, причем со всей страны, и это будет очень востребовано.
В год образования ждут серьезных перемен и вложений. В школах Удмуртии будут открыты дополнительные медицинские, сельскохозяйственные и IT-классы. Информационные технологии будут изучать